Hello and welcome to the Expanse. I'm the Quack and I hope you're having a less quack day than myself. This is part 5 of Flames of Dawn. If you have not watched the prior parts of this content, I highly suggest watching the parts prior to this one, or the full version of this content. Links will be provided. To continue from where the last part left off, to start explaining the theory behind this myriad of information, we start with the sun. Anshe, the assumed equal of Elune, is basically MIA on Azeroth. It is very doubtful this occurred without something assumedly bad happening, raising a plethora of who's, what's, and why's. Through Uldum, it becomes clear Azeroth has gods similar to the Arakoan gods on the planet. Anshe being the Rukmar, Falcon, Hawk, Eagle, Firebird, Phoenix equivalent, Bonsamdi most likely being the Anzu, Raven, Crow equivalent, and Takar being the Seethe, Wind Serpent equivalent. Through the visages used on the Watchers of Uldum, it can be inferred the Titans had some form of interaction with all of the Azerothian equivalents of these gods. The most likely scenario is the Raven and the Phoenix were inducted into another pantheon of lower similar to the Wild Gods, and possibly tied to another realm similar to the Dream. The Watchers of Uldum also imply something else. Isaset, the Watcher of Magic, is the only humanoid-faced Watcher in comparison to the others. The implication is at some point in the timeline the Raven was most likely changed into a different form, and raised to the position of the moon, becoming a Elune. This was most likely done using the Obelisk of the Stars and the Ascension ritual related to the obelisk. Following this revelation, another of the Arakoan gods needs to be acknowledged, specifically the Raven Mother. Assuming the similarities in personalities carry over, the characteristics of the Raven Mother match that of Elune. Both see the necessity in balance, both purposely have little to no interaction with the mortal world, and both give compassion to those that are not their own, and invite them into their own families. In the case of the Raven Mother, it was adopting the outcasts as a part of her flock. In the case of Elune, it was transforming the Dark Trolls into elves. With the revelation the Raven Mother was most likely the Raven depicted in Uldum and the connection to Elune established, one glaring question follows. Why was Azeroth's Raven Mother transformed in the first place, and why does the moon seemingly have the powers attributed to the sun? The first assumption is the Titans did what they usually do and changed things according to their will, which is possible, however, with the very prominent existence of sun-related Titan Forge like the Amentet and Raj, it's quite apparent they were willing to use the power of the sun, and for the most part did not see a reason to seal the power away or transfer it to another being. The next likely culprits to have transformed the Raven Mother are the Keepers. If the Fetid Devourer and the Binding of the Wild Gods is any indication, the Keepers were quite willing to alter lower. This is where Tyr becomes very important. Assuming Tyr, at least in part, served the same purpose as his Titan equivalent Agramar, it can be assumed Tyr's main duty was to ensure the safety and integrity of Azeroth's souls, or the souls of the Titan Forged, possibly both. This was most likely done with the Halls of Valor, and locations like Stormheim, which contained places like Agramar's Vault. Now, as the story goes, after the departure of the Pantheon, Tyr is described as being the only active keeper on Azeroth. So other than looking after his own section of interest, he also looked after most of Azeroth because the other keepers had become reclusive and apathetic. Now, in Dawn of the Aspects, it is heavily implied that Tyr is in part responsible for Galakrond going mad, and it is heavily implied he had been experimenting with the Proto-Drakes trying to create new protectors of Azeroth. This circumstance leads on to two possibilities depending on whether you think these events happened before or after Galakrond. The first possibility, assuming everything happened before Galakrond, is Tyr wasn't only experimenting on dragons. Prior to Galakrond, Tyr may have tried elevating Anshe using the Obelisk of the Stars, the logic being the light, at least at first, made Anshe appear to be a noble creature worthy of the role. This assumption went horribly wrong, however, possibly in a similar fashion to Galakrond, and Tyr was forced to lock away Anshe, as he may have begun to use the souls of the Valorous to become incredibly powerful. In the process, Tyr may have had to transfer most of Anshe's power to another creature, specifically the Raven Mother, and in the process create Elune. Tyr's experiment may have also resulted in Bonsamdi's current state, and why Hakar has an exposed chest cavity. The The second possibility, and the possibility that I think is most likely in relation to this part of the theory, is after Galakrond and gaining the Silver Hand, Tyr started to gain more clarity in relation to the light's magic. I think he started to realise the extremes of light were just as bad as the extremes of the shadow. The reason for this is Galakrond's fall and his need to consume seems to have something to do with being empowered by the sparks of Tyr, artifacts that have been shown to fluctuate between the light and the shadow, implying they have a close connection to the extremes of the light and the shadow. Now, with this new perspective, I think Tyr started to travel Azeroth and started to notice the injustices being perpetrated by creatures related to the light, which, after everything I've mentioned in this theory, wouldn't really have been that hard to find. I mean, when looking at the light as a whole, between crazed zealotry which would see planets burn, as seen with the Amenethet, addiction which I haven't mentioned but is something you can see in some Morkadesco, Kaelia Benethil before she was dead, and growing in Anduin if you've read Before the Storm, complete servitude that would see people surrender all independent will, and the sheer arrogance and pride related to those of the light, which can see people act in the most heinous of manners, it really wouldn't have been that hard for Tyr to find what he may have started to suspect. This is where Tyr, Uldum, Arnshay and the Tauren most likely converged. Assuming Arnshay at this point was some form of Titan chosen lower which had some relative influence on Azeroth, I would be willing to guess Arnshay started to become zealous, power hungry, and overall probably started to get a god complex. A complex so large, this Mayan deity probably started to do things against the Titan's will. However, I think Arnshay eventually did two specific things that broke the camel's back and without question drew the eyes of the newly enlightened Tyr. The first thing Arnshay probably did was use the Obelisk of the Stars to ascend himself, granting him way more power than he originally had, which was considerable to begin with. They have also done this to their followers, possibly creating types of Naru. The second thing I think they started to do was mess with dead spirits, once again specifically powerful and valorous ones, and started to use them to empower himself. The reason I think this is twofold. As we see with the Nightmare, light magic is quite susceptible to the Shadow's influence, yet when you compare the light's effect on life magic it seems rather weak. Which, considering plants and photosynthesis probably being a thing in World of Warcraft, it kind of makes a lot of sense. On the flip side, with death, it seems to be the complete opposite. The light is very effective against death magic, and the shadow is seemingly weak against it. Overall, it seems as if dead spirits were an easy target for Arnshay. Couple this with the Brook Mogu seemingly being sun-related Mogu that use necromancy to empower their statues, and it's not as if there is a precedent for this. Now, as I mentioned before, Tyr seems to have been related to the protection and fortification of souls. So if any of the keepers were going to notice what was going on, it was going to be Tyr. Especially if we consider the concept of anima and how your deeds in life can turn your soul into a powerful fuel source. Tyr, being the best fighter in the Pantheon, was probably tasked with looking after this power. Now, assuming this theory is right, Tyr and his allies, which at this point I would assume were any species on Azeroth at the time with a grudge against Arnshay, including the Tol'vir, Tauren, Trolls, and some lower, were able to stop whatever god-ascending plan Arnshay had. There was just one problem. I don't think Tyr at the time had the capability of killing Arnshay. Now, whether this was because of the Ascension ritual, or the fact that I think all of this happened concurrently with Odin raising the Halls of Valor and possibly removing Tyr's ability to kill Arnshay, is something I'm unsure of. However, I am convinced instead of killing Arnshay, Tyr imprisoned him and his most devout followers with the help of the Raven Mother and possibly Arcadis. Arcadis most likely building new prisons around Azeroth to hold the entities, possibly creating one under Alterac, while Tyr and the Raven Mother subdued Arnshay. To do this, I think Tyr ascended the Raven Mother to become a deity of the moon, and in the process figured out a way to transfer Arnshay's newfound power to her, in the process creating Elune, a ridiculously powerful loa with a mix of arcane and light abilities. After these events unfolded, I would be willing to assume this is where the sun and worship of the sun start to disappear. The cultures that had known about Arnshay, like the Tol'vir and the Tauren, probably moved on, slowly filtering out the sun, knowing how dangerous it was. Then as time moved on, and the Keepers fell, the re-origination of Uldum happened, and the enslavement of the Tauren occurred, in turn, the history of the sun, and to an extent the moon, were forgotten, which overall is a very, very bad thing For as hinted at with Ornahara, Ordos, and Lordain, the sun's influence may have faded, but it most certainly hasn't died. If anything, it's probably been trying to escape, has been looking for ways to spread its influence, and is quite apparently not benevolent in its methods. When the humans ripped the veil, I think they may have tapped into the prison of Anshe and started a chain of events that's going to see an enemy equal to Elune, if not more powerful than Elune, turn up out of nowhere and start causing major problems. As the Black Empire is bad, but an Empire of the Sun, I guarantee you, is equal in all its depravity. Now, as conclusions go in relation to this theory, that is the more grounded version. That fits rather nicely with most of the information we have in World of Warcraft so far. However, it doesn't address the rather glaring pieces of lore that make large pieces of this theory invalid, or make little to no sense. The main issue being when certain events happened and their relation to the past. This leads on to the more quacked conclusion. The conclusion I'd argue is lore breaking. Not in the sense that it breaks the lore, it's just that if any of this quacked conclusion is even remotely accurate, the term monolithic isn't going to cover the magnitude of universe-changing lore drops we are going to get in the near future. What am I talking about? Well, I didn't mention the idea of things being older than the Titan's presence on Azeroth or possibly the Black Empire for no reason. There's just one fun fact I need to state before we get into the rest of this quacked theory. Wind serpents are cousins of cloud serpents, and when flesh-shaped enough, the amalgamation that forms from a cloud serpent is a hydra. Why is that important? Well, one of the oddest bits of lore surrounding Kakar is that he can apparently only be summoned in Zul'Gurub. There is basically little to no explanation behind that until you realise something about Pandaria. Y'Shaarj breathed on Pandaria forever, changing the land. The assumption is that is what caused the Shah. And in part, it may have. However, the heart of Y'Shaarj seemed to be the major contributor to the Shah's existence. So the question is, why mention the idea Y'Shaarj breathed on the land in the first place? The only answer that really exists within Pandaria is that it creates an ambiguous connection to Elune, the Jade Serpent, who breathes on statues to reincarnate herself. Interestingly enough, this connection is the final puzzle piece that explains the odd bit of lore surrounding Kakar. Because, as I mentioned, wind serpents and cloud serpents are supposed to be cousins, meaning similar things happen to each species when exposed to certain conditions. Y'Shaarj was the god of 7 heads, and I personally don't think that is a metaphor. I think Y'Shaarj was literally a 7-headed god by the end of its life, specifically a hydra. Now, we could assume all 7 heads breathed on one location, but what if they didn't? What if all 7 heads breathed on different parts of the world, infusing the land with different forms of corruption? Worse yet, what if, similar to the heart of Y'Shaarj, the heads of Y'Shaarj landed in these separate locations and happened to turn into their own independent creatures? Creatures that were eventually caught, experimented on, and altered by the Titans. Now, just so we're on the same page, yes, I am saying Elune, Kakar, Quetzalcoatl, and maybe Thoranja were the heads of Y'Shaarj. And considering this pattern has followed the major Zul's outside of Zuldazar, as in each tribe has a wind serpent present within its pantheon, there is a distinct possibility that Moizala may have been the wind serpent of Zul-F, and Janali, the very odd, possibly altered Dragonhawk, may have been the wind serpent of Zul-A, flesh-shaped together with a firehawk. The joke is, that's only 6 names. There is still a missing head. 2 if you assume Zuldrak only had 1 head land in its vicinity. But sticking with only 1 head being left, it's rather funny how the last name makes a perfect 7, that name possibly being Y'Shaarj, and possibly hinting at a missing Zul on Azeroth. Anyway, how does this connect to the overall theory? The answer is blood magic / flesh shaping. To create a hydra out of a cloud serpent, all you have to do is flesh shape it in a similar way to the Mogu, and the resulting mess will turn into a hydra. Now, you remember how I mentioned Seed and Kakar seemed familiar? And how I mentioned Bwonsamdi may be the Anzu equivalent on Azeroth? And how he may have had wings once upon a time? And had been connected to the Kyrian? Also remember how Skirtish Hollow seems like a toned down version of Nazmir? And you know how Nazmir is arguably the home of blood magic on Azeroth? Well, at this point I'm hoping it's all starting to come together. There is just one more bit of information you need to know. AQ, Uldum, Pandaria, Suramar, in particularly Pandaria and Suramar, reinforce the idea there are places on Azeroth that can be a part of the world yet completely isolated from everything else and be fully functional societies. Nazmir just happens to have a hidden piece of lore which implies a place called Zal-Nazman existed on the site of Uldir. This lore talks of invincible walls, how the lore watched over them and how they will stand forever. There's just one problem. The existence of Zal-Nazman does not fit into the known timeline of the Trolls. Zuldazar is the earliest known Zul of the Trolls. Now, you could make the argument Zal-Nazman must have existed during the era of the Titans, and it's quite possible it did. However, that would contradict the Trolls' worship of the Lower, as they were literal test subjects of the Titans, leaving two eras we know of that Zal-Nazman may have existed in, the Black Empire and the Reign of the Elements. Now, where we know Lower can constitute old god-like figures, the lack of Shathiar, original old god influence, and the need for walls considering Zandalar's location on Pangaea Azeroth doesn't add up, leaving one specific era left, the Reign of the Elements. And we know, thanks to Shadows of the Horde, there has likely been Lower around since the formation of Azeroth. Then, when you consider the need for invincible walls and the need to be protected by the Lower, it's not much of a stretch to assume what those walls were defending against considering the carnage the Elemental Lords were wreaking at the time. This implies the only time Zal-Nazman could have existed was during the Reign of the Elements. And just to be clear, yes, I am saying Zal-Nazman was a precursor civilization that predated the Black Empire. What's rather funny though is when you consider the inexplicable age of Uldum and the defense mechanism of sealing the region off from the rest of the world, which if I'm not mistaken no other Titan facility has demonstrated, on top of Black Rockhold, the home of the Raven Lord, and the Temple of Elune / Suramar's relatively close proximity to each other, both existing on the Broken Isle and the Isle itself just happening to be eerily related to the Shadowlands, what you get are three precursor civilizations. One of the Serpent in Zal-Nazman, one of the Ravens in Suramar, and one of the Phoenix in Uldum, all of which I'd be willing to bet were diverse in the races that existed within them, as in it's quite possible they contained Kyrian, Tolvir, and Tauren. It is also likely they had some interactions with each other, sharing similar gods and beliefs. I would also be willing to say all probably fell around the same time because of each other. You see, if these civilizations did worship the Azerothian equivalents of the Arakoan gods, and were similar in their relations to each other, then it is highly likely events played out in a similar fashion to what happened on Draenor, just quite literally on a larger, world-ending scale instead. But what do I mean? Well, if there was a precursor civilization of the Wind Serpent, then it is likely they had blood magic / blood rituals surrounding that serpent, and eventually they may have headed on a warpath with the civilization of the Phoenix, similar to the Arakoa and their gods. However, on Azeroth, for some reason, the practices of blood within the civilization of Zal-Nazman were outlawed. The question is why until you read Bwonsamdi, the Raven God who meddles in the affairs of mortals / those who are not under his purview, was made the royal lower of assumedly Zal-Nazman. This most likely kicked off the conflict between the Raven and the Serpent, the result being similar to that on Draenor, but the cost of the Raven's form, soul, and a piece of the land which it had set out to protect. What's worse than Draenor though is the Serpent on Azeroth may have instead succeeded in dooming the world. As was hopefully understood earlier, the Serpent, due to the blood magic at play, may have turned itself into a hydra, and become what we know as Y'Shaarj, the god of seven heads, and quite possibly upon its first death, transformed its remains into the most powerful old god and in the process beckoned the shadow to Azeroth, kicking off the Black Empire and climbing to the peak of its power. However, there is also one other possibility that relates to this part of the theory. The Serpent may have been defeated, and the Raven cursed in the process. However, those afflicted by the curse, instead of humbling the civilization of the Phoenix, could have started a crusade against those the Phoenix considered corrupted by the Serpent's power. This is where the Raven Mother and the Phoenix would have come into conflict, for where the Raven Mother may not like interfering in mortal affairs, she will step in when times become dire enough as is seen when she helps us defeat the adherents in Warlords of Draenor. At the end of this conflict, the Raven Mother would have won, assumedly taking the power of the sun and becoming Elune, while locking away the Phoenix to service the sun we see today. And where this would fit nicely, there is just one problem stemming from a fact I've been holding on to this entire theory. In the Temple of the Jade Serpent, we are told through a boss fight that Azeroth once upon a time had 5 suns. 4 were shot down, and 1 was left in the sky. The civilization of the Phoenix may have created the Obelisk of the Stars before the Titans arrived, and may have elevated others to a position similar to that of the Phoenix. And maybe, just maybe, as the Raven Mother defeated each of these Ascended, with the help of certain Azerothian species like the Shahalo, and possibly took the powers of these false suns, they fell, falling from the sky drained of their light, and as they plummeted, shifted to entities of shadow. Upon impact, warping everything they touched and transforming into mounds of hungering flesh that could create their own life, transforming into old gods. What's rather funny about this theory is in Chronicle Volume 3, we got a hint at there being 5 old gods. So if you go with both possibilities surrounding the civilization of the Serpent and the Phoenix happening concurrently, you actually get a reason for why 5 old gods emerged on Azeroth around the same time. 1 was created from the cursed blood of the Serpent, while the other 4 were created by the hunger and hubris of the light. With that said, I would actually be implying there were originally 8 old gods, 7 if you discount Anzu's Raven equivalent, who technically would have ended up considerably weaker than the other gods, and would have probably gotten kicked out of his god status, or possibly abandoned it for a time after it was cursed. This implies Nazmir would have been ground zero for the creation of Y'Shaarj, and why the Titans' earliest experiments were located in the region. Overall, to answer the initial question of this theory, the reason Anshe was locked away and seemingly stricken from the record was because him and the Serpent basically ensured the Black Empire's existence and fundamentally destroyed the planet, which saw the Black Empire rise and the loss of most history before the Empire's rise. The Titans probably found remnants of these civilizations during the war with the Black Empire, and if I was to guess, made contact with Elune, explaining this one line from Chronicle Volume 1 that has bugged me for ages. The Keepers and their allies. What allies? At this point in the book, it seemed rather odd to start calling the Titanforged allies of the Keepers. This partnership between Elune and the Titans probably culminated in the fall of the Black Empire. However, after that, your guess is as good as mine, as it seems the Moon decided to stay in a rather reserved role until it altered the Dark Trolls and created the Night Elves. Then again, considering the Raven Mother's personality, that would explain the connection to the Shadowlands. Oh right, I didn't explain that part. What happened to Elune after the defeat and imprisonment of the Sun, possibly in the Northern Eastern Kingdoms, and the rise of the Black Empire. I mentioned before the Raven Mother on Draenor knew the destruction of Draenor was coming, so for whatever reason, she had semi-accurate foresight, which, considering the Night Elves' connection to Elune, may explain Star Augur Atreus's and Elisan's powers. Now, the Raven Mother promised her flock she would take them to her Dark Realm to protect them from the destruction. If Elune and the Raven Mother are supposed to be similar characters, and in turn both made a similar promise, and Bonsam-Di had wings similar to a Kyrian before the curse, then my assumption is, with the power Elune gathered from the suns, she probably fulfilled the promise and created Oribus, and the Shadowlands we are going to see, to escape the Black Empire. And yes, I am implying Elune is the Arbiter, is that old, and the eerily weird connection that can be made between the Broken Isle and the Shadowlands is no coincidence. They're similar because Elune probably attempted to make her perfect, quote-unquote, purified dream in the image of her people's homeland. In the present, we see remnants of these civilizations, as hopefully demonstrated by the evidence I've provided over the course of this theory, and I think Shadowlands is going to reveal the Sun, and even the Serpent, are very close to making a return. I should also mention, where I have connected the 4 missing suns to the Old Gods, there is a possibility they were never connected to them. The reason why is that the only other reference in-game that seems to connect the 5 suns are the 5 sisters, the rock formation in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, where you can find Solux during the Mogu invasions, and oddly enough, another mantid paragon unearthed in the middle of the stones during the mantid invasions. Anche is a he, so he wouldn't be considered a sister, meaning if the 5 sisters are connected to the suns, then Azeroth is missing 5 celestial objects, specifically suns. Technically 6 if you take into consideration the Shrine of the 2 Moons and the Shrine of the 7 Stars, assuming the suns are being equated to stars. The final joke of this theory is I thought I would completely disprove the existence of the Void Lords creating this. Turns out though, they still fit in rather nicely as a mystery to still be discovered. As yeah, the elements may have been the reason the 3 civilizations established themselves to begin with, but if Elune did create Oribus, then the indication is the civilizations probably knew about the Maw, which as threats go is considerably more dangerous, and until confirmed otherwise, the Maw and Jailor could still have connections to the Void Lords. And B, don't think I forgot about the other Uldum Watchers. The Jackal and the Ram are curious because of their magical alignments. One represents life similar to the Evergrowth, which is not a good thing I might add, while the Jackal represents chaos, however does not seem to represent any type of chaos magic we've seen before, and instead looks like he is connected to the Shadow, raising the possibility the Jackal may have been or is related to the Void Lords. But for now, we are at the end. I will probably do content on those concepts at a later date, but for now, this theory has definitely gone on long enough. Thank you for watching.